Clubhouse.
Welcome to another edition of Battle Beyond the Movies, the podcast where two movies with similar themes go to battle to find out which one did it best. This is Paul from Pod Clubhouse, and this week I am ecstatic to have on the show a pal that I've been chatting about TV and movies with since Desmond Hume was the constant. Inez Vivar, you are the next contestant on Battle Beyond the Movies.
That is an intro. Thanks, Paul. Welcome. I'm happy to be here.
I am so glad that you decided to sign on with me. We've podcasted before in the past, but never quite as free form as this discussion is hoping to be.
I know. We've been chatting about movies and stuff since 2008. So we've got a great thing going on. I'm happy to see this evolution here, and I'm ready to battle it out.
Meet the combatants.
Last week's episode with Cops and Robbers is downright playful compared to this week's comparison of the 1990 cinematic version of Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale and the 2006 adaptation of P.D. James' novel Children of Men. Did you have any prior association with these movies, Inez?
No, as soon as you gave me my battle assignments, Paul, this was fresh for me. This is exciting.
Well, had you watched the show of Handmaid's Tale before?
Yeah, I've watched the show and I've read the book. So I did have some background context for Handmaid's Tale, but I'd never seen the movie from 1990. So
it's weird, right? How what is on the page in the book is represented on screen. You can't argue that it's not, right?
Right. Oh, my God. Yeah.
I've never read the P.D. James novel, and this is very interesting to find out, but you're going to have to help me with the director's name because I can't pronounce it without someone telling me. Do you know how to say his name?
Is it Alfonso Cuarón?
That sounds exactly right to me. But when he adapted the screenplay, he was more in love with the idea and the story points and continuing to improve the script as he inherited it from another writer. And he wanted the purity of that idea. So he didn't read the novel when he adapted the screenplay.
Oh, interesting.
But the funny thing is that P.D. James loves the movie. So I guess it all worked out.
Success. It's a fantastic movie. Oh, my God.
So I'll run down some of the high points of each movie. Handmaid's Tale came out in 1990, directed by German director Volker Schlöndorff. He's most well known for having directed a German movie known as The Tin Drum. This was a pretty famous movie from 1979 and really stuck in that area, Europe movies, German movies, that area is where he mostly worked. So The Handmaid's Tale was sort of stepping out for him. For his efforts, his movie garnered a worldwide gross of only $4.9 million. And that's not a lot, even in 1990.
No, that's interesting. I had to kind of reframe my mind too, right? Because I'm not super familiar with a lot of like movies from like the early 90s era that are like this serious tone because I was only 4 years old in 1990. So
right.
Right. So
more in the Little Mermaid type era of your movie watching.
Yes. And so so watching this now and realizing that I'm watching a serious tone film from that area was something I also kind of had to process and reframe my thoughts and my expectation of the experience, just because I'm so used to, like the really big, like flashy, high tech kind of stuff now. So that I've seen, and I'm a huge fan of the Handmaid's Tale series and that kind of storytelling. So I'm just kind of resetting my expectations on that era. But I feel like it is very different than a lot of films that I am familiar about from that era.
On paper, The Handmaid's Tale should have been kind of a home run because it had the Tin Drum director. People like that movie. It had a guy named Harold Pinter who adapted the screenplay from the novel. Harold Pinter is a well-known screenwriter and playwright who was actually a Nobel laureate later in his life. So the guy knows how to write, is what that means. It stars Oscar winners Robert Duvall and Faye Dunaway. Elizabeth McGovern, who played Moira, would go on to get a nomination later in life. And if you watch Downton Abbey, you know her. And Natasha Richardson played the titular handmaid, renamed Kate in this one, much like how they picked the name June for the TV show, since the character's never named in the book. Because it's from her point of view, I guess. Why would you name yourself? They named her Kate.
Yeah, it's a really great cast.
I found out that the role had actually almost gone to Sigourney Weaver, but ironically, she dropped out because she was pregnant.
Oh, wow. That is a very fun fact.
Isn't it?
Yeah, interesting. Oh, man. Like, I'm now just like picturing what this would have been like with Sigourney Weaver. I mean, that makes sense. She was such a huge star for those movies in that era. And this is such a important role. But I really love Natasha Richardson. And she did a really great job in this.
Full of stars and full of, if they weren't stars then they went on to become bigger stars later. But not everybody loved what came out. 32% on Rotten Tomatoes. And Harold Pinter, the writer, regards the script as something he would later disown, if that's such a thing.
What?
Because he felt that the final version was so compromised from what he had adapted.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. I also have to think about like what is socially acceptable kind of climate back in the 90s too. And that's probably why it seems like post like the Me Too campaign and a lot of those kinds of progressive movements in this way, that The Handmaid's Tale's whole storyline seems to be like just more like respected or taken. The theme is just a little bit more
present in what's going
present.
on. Right
Yes.
now.
Oh, you read my mind, Paul. I was going to say present. Look at us. And then trying to think about the kind of culture that existed in the United States back in 1990 when this is released. It's just very taboo.
Right. Like Vanilla Ice was having a very high time in his life right then. That was the America
Word to your mother.
that we had right then. MC Hammer and stuff was kind of a big deal. And that's where our minds were at largely. You know, it was around the era when the Cold War was ending, you know, so American ideals were feeling like, I don't know, I guess we didn't want to really look quite inward like that. That the way that this kind of topic was asking audiences to examine, even though the book had only come out a couple years before this.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, on the other hand, 2006, Children of Men, Alfonso's movie, he also had a hand in writing this one after a few other writers came into contact with it, but he's also credited as a screenwriter. This one also did not make a ton of money, $70 million versus a $76 million cost to make it. So that's not terrific in Hollywood talk.
That is very interesting.
However, 92% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah. It's such a fantastic movie. This was my first time watching it. I never watched it before. I've seen it. You know, my husband had been telling me to watch it. He's always said that he wanted me to watch it. I've tried before, and for whatever reason, I think I had like a baby like back when I was first kind of attempting it, and I just couldn't get into it because I just kept being distracted by that. And then my younger sister, Gabby, she has always been a huge fan of this and telling me I needed to watch it. And so thanks to your invite to this really awesome opportunity here, Battle of the Movies, I had to jump on this.
Would you be surprised to learn that Alfonso was the first Mexican-born director to win an Oscar?
You know, I might not. I don't think that I'm really surprised by it. You know, I'm a Hispanic, so I'm half Mexican, and I follow a lot of the status quo of where things are. So I am surprised because he is so clearly talented and he's directed other films that I love. Like Y Tu Mamá También was like one of those films that just like stuck with me and it's like gutted me. And so I was a huge fan of his back then. So from a talent perspective, I am surprised, but also from like a culturally, like how people of color movement in Hollywood, kind of not surprised. And I don't mean to be like a downer in that, just kind of keeping it real here.
Well, I mean, it was a big deal. It wasn't for this movie. It was for Gravity. But he's been nominated and won twice for Gravity and Roma. I never saw Roma, though.
Me neither. I haven't seen Gravity either, I don't think.
Much different movie because it is almost all like an action type narrative. Like it's just bad shit just keeps happening to Sandra Bullock, one right after the other, and her
Oh,
life
yes,
is at
I
stake.
have.
It
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But a lot of people know him best, and his highest grossing movie was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban.
Yeah, I saw that.
They needed to take Harry toward a darker path than the previous Chris Columbus movies had gone.
And they achieved that.
They
Yeah,
did
that
that.
was. Yeah, that tone was totally achieved there. You know, he has a kind of like a trademark storytelling way in that.
It's ultimately hopeful, but it's very hopeless before you get there, right?
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Like I mentioned, Y tu mamá también is one that like, it almost like traumatized me a little bit. It was such a great film, such an impactful film. The way that the story was told had just a lot of rawness to it. And I felt that rawness in Children of Men.
Well, this movie, he started to pre-produce after that one, Y tu mamá. But the producers for Azkaban came and said, would you work this up now? And he said yes. So even though this one was next, he did Harry Potter first and then this one.
Oh, I see. Very
Yeah,
cool.
they were hot to get on Alfonso's train at that point.
Yeah. And it's fun because they're like completely different genres across these little hops. But he still kind of has just such an impact on each thing that he leaves behind. I love his work.
The Battleground.
On my last episode, the Master Detective versus Master Criminal episode featuring Mike from the Geekdom fan cast, when I mentioned this episode's theme, Mike had one demand, that I do it with a woman.
Yes. I'm here to represent the vaginas in this conversation.
Come forth. All right. Well, given the grim theme tying these two movies together, what about them made you want to sign up with me for this chat?
Oh, you know, I always have just like a lot of curiosity and think a lot about like what ifs. And so these dystopian genres, they give me this really out of the box perspective on what could be or what something typically looks like. I'm very primary visual learner. And so I think it's one thing for me when I'm reading it and I'm feeling all of the feelings as I'm reading the story on pages. But watching it, I start to connect with it from like me. If that's me in that situation, what does that mean to me? And those things that stick with me. And this topic is really important to me. You know, I am a woman and I've learned the history of the progressive like suffrage movement here and how I am where I am. So I don't take any of my female heritage for granted at all. I'm so like very grateful to all of the people that have made this come. So these topics specifically touching on the subject of these is women. It was like kind of like a double peak. So let me like see how I can put on my like activist hat and like, you know, the kind of extra like ammo that I need to understand like how I can further like participate in that growth. So these kinds of topics just give me a lot of that interest, and I think it does spark like other kinds of hats that I wear in my life.
One fun fact about the Children of Men book was that it was opposite in the book, that the men were definitely infertile and the women were okay. Instead of in the movie, the women are infertile and the men are okay. I mean, that one little change, I don't know if it saved the movie per se, but it's more like it made the movie important and timeless to an extent. The concept of female reproductive rights is a topic, like you just mentioned, we're not quite done settling for some reason. By making the movie about that, then it stays relevant. As a theme, it's not one that you see Hollywood dip into yearly, but it's enough that we could have picked a couple other movies and tied them into this theme. This idea that sometime in the future, things go bad and childbirth declines and all of a sudden needs to be regulated and controlled. Is this something you think that people are going to get tired of seeing, or do you think in this political climate that we've had for the last several years, that we are a people just ripe to explore this concept further.
I don't think that this theme's going to run out. I mean, I still participate or I witness current conversations around my own like family planning. There's people that feel the need to let me know that it's wrong of me that I've decided to stop having children. You know, I only have one child, one daughter, and my husband and I decided this is right for us, right for our family. And we really don't cast any judgment on anybody else that chooses to extend their family even farther, or if people decide to abstain from having children altogether. I'm kind of like all about you do you and let me do me. But it does still regularly come up. Strangers will let me know that I am being selfish, that I need to have more children, that there's all these things that could go wrong with my daughter. And then I see them also say the same thing to people who decide that they don't want to have children. I'm always coming across articles about there's a decline in, multi-children family households and what is to blame. I even saw one that was like saying millennials' fault for the decline of children. And I'm like, what? Like, no, that's like money. Money is the problem here, guys. If you give me more money, I probably would be willing to have more children. But
I don't think that's true, Inez.
Well, maybe not anymore. I'm really living my life, my best life right now with my single daughter, and she loves being an only child. But yeah, I think this is like active things that are happening in my everyday life. These are comments that I have to deal with strangers all the time. I think that if anybody tries to say that this topic is just kind of run its course, are people that just don't want to acknowledge that other ways of life are valid. That's why here we are with Handmaid's Tale, in the past 4 years, and this book was written in the 80s, right?
Yes.
And then so obviously like people still care about it. And I feel like when Handmaid's Tale was launched, it was intentionally to be directly aligned with the political climate of that time.
Given all that, that's a great lead into The Fight.
The Fight.
This is where we talk about how these movies represent the themes that they have in common. There's specific plot points and things that they do well or not, in some cases, to address these themes. Like you're talking about when it comes to reproductive rights, even though in Children of Men there have been no babies for 18 years, if you looked carefully around the various sets, around London especially, where there was so much more to see than when they were out in the countryside or whatever, you would see signage from the government saying skipping a fertility test was illegal, and other little hints like that there was this huge clampdown on women. In the scope of what's going on in Children of Men, nobody's had a baby in 18 years. Are you supposed to come out of the movie theater asking the question, like, is it okay then? Or is it still not okay?
I'm a person of science. If Mother Nature is trying to knock out the human race, just knock us the fuck out, and like we just have to deal with it. We are not bigger than the earth as a biological organism. We're just basically trying to fight what's to come. I think that the laws, as long as it's been considered by a group of people that is inclusive of fair representation of women,
voters
or the people,
and such.
right? Like, I don't know, like a conversation, like as long as like it just seems like in both of these scenarios, men in the government just decided this is it and this is what's going to happen, and then we just have to like follow it. And it's just it's like that very forceful kind of thing. It doesn't feel like a woman is leading the change management here.
One thing that they do have in common, though, is that in both cases, if you have the babies, it seems like there was a lot of power assigned to babies. And that makes sense. But the way that they were being wielded was very foreign to our point of view here in our time, in our space. The idea that you would have a very few amount of babies that you need in order to perpetuate the race, but you're going to wield them like weapons for your cause rather than a resource for continuing at the human race,
I think like having a champion piece of it, like in both these cases, makes sense for inspiring people to get on board with your cause. But it just seems like the strategy in both of these is still dehumanizing women, and women literally are the creators of life. Like no other human being other than women have the ability to like stitch together biological tissue and create life. And that's and both of these films, it's they do a really great job of stripping that significance from the woman and making her into a tool. I think that if a woman was participating in like conversations as like an agent of change, then you could absolutely, as a community, come up with the way with how do we try to address this in like, you know, that is safe for everybody, fair to everybody. And it's like volunteers or incentivized, like, you know, instead of forcing people with like fear, because all of that just adds stress. It's like if you want to try to populate, like one of the things that they tell you when you're trying to conceive is the mother's body cannot be like stressed. Like you want to keep it as calm and happy and nurtured and healthy as possible to increase the probability of a successful insemination and successful pregnancy.
So that's pretty much the Handmaid experience. Right?
Right. And both of these scenarios is like, obviously women are not like involved in leadership levels at all, because from a biological standpoint, they're causing their own failure of this initiative.
In both scenarios, you have what appears to be a very fascistic regime that takes over in both America. It becomes a republic known as Gilead. And in England, it just seems like they just change all the rules and really tighten up on people, particularly with regard to immigration. That's a large part of the set is there's constantly people being deported, and the whole last section of the movie takes place in a section of England that has been converted into a refugee camp, but used to be apparently a place you could live normally, but now it's just a walled off refugee slum. What about this topic you think makes that slide into fascism just like an automatic? Like these authors are like, well, of course that would happen.
I definitely saw that they were intentionally paralleling this to the Holocaust. It felt like it was kind of like walking down to the experience that I saw like from the Holocaust museums of what all of this population of people who were murdered went through. And so I think that they did that. Well, I'm talking about children and men specifically at this point. I'm sure that was intentional to get people to understand like the kind of intensity. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder like how much is it that they want us to build empathy for like real life events? You know, like building as some kind of like subtle education for people so that when somebody says, no, man, it makes me like, it gave me totally feels of like what I've learned from about the Holocaust. And then you have this visualization that you start to imagine like real life, what people must be feeling. And it might build a little bit of empathy later. That's just kind of like my own side thought train that I probably was having.
Well, part of that is like Alfonso in particular, not the other director, but Alfonso, he wants that documentary kind of feel, the way that he uses like the handheld cameras that are chasing Theo in between bullets and gunfire and debris blowing everywhere. And it feels like we're right there with him storming the beach or whatever he's trying to do. And that increases that engagement, or whatever you want to call it, that identification with Theo as our guy trying to get us through there with Key and the baby and all that. That style drew me in for sure. Whereas, you know, with Handmaid's, goodness, that felt a little more clinical in comparison.
Right. Yeah.
But you still got the same idea, but you didn't get sort of that drawn in, like I'm there in the middle of it with them feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. The cinematography in Children of Men was so addicting. Like once you realize that this is like how they're going to tell this story, I was totally hooked. I thought it was brilliant. And I looked up the cinematographer, Emanuel Lubezki. Yeah, and he also was a cinematographer for Y Tu Mamá También. So I was like, oh, of course. And then, and then also Meet Joe Black and Sleepy Hollow. So I just kind of started thinking about like his kind of style also being integrated here is just kind of like that quietness in terms of like not a lot of like extra musical kind of sounds to be distracted. It's kind of like sucks you into the sounds of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And Children of Men, that just more modern experience was very intense, especially because the actions of the characters themselves, it wasn't like this, like a glorified like action film, you know, where like somebody gets like one of the people that comes out to be like a big character, just all of a sudden it's just like dies. When they get shot with a bullet, they just die, versus action flicks where like they get shot like 10 times, but they're still like going and running and tumbling and everything. And so it's been a while since I've had that kind of rawness. And I love that rawness, that raw feeling. Those are kind of my most like favorite kinds of films are like that. And yeah, so in Handmaid's Tale, it is dated. It's probably, I'm just kind of attributed the delivery style to be maybe more aligned with how storytelling was done in cinema in the early 90s. I'm not, you know,
I don't know.
I don't know though, right? Like it's just not my, it's not like, it did seem very bounced, like, well, it did flow in a story, but I felt like I find myself in like appreciating the Handmaid's Tale show for giving me fillers in between events, because it felt like in Handmaid's Tale, it was kind of could jump really quickly, and I probably could be a little bit lost if I had not already seen the Handmaid's Tale show. That kind of gives me a little bit more context about Of Glen, a little bit more context around Moira and stuff, versus like here we only got the perspective of the handmaid and not much more. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really like. My commentary earlier was purely just like my ignorance of like cinema knowledge and cinema styles of that era.
This one's quirky of that era. I'll let you know. When I came into contact with this, I was in high school, and this was just something that was on HBO, and I had HBO in my room, and I watched it because occasionally there were boobs, because that's how teenage boys' brains work.
Yeah, I don't mind looking at boobs either. It's okay.
Yeah, well, you know, given the subject matter and the seriousness, especially where we are today, and then my teenage brain in the 90s being like boobs is like the worst kind of irony, right?
I totally okay. No, that's good for me to know, because I honestly, like, I'm always asking my husband like random questions where I'm like curious, like, what does a teenage boy like think? What did you think about it? Like, as I'm like, I grew up with sisters, and you know, so I'm always like, what is it that like boys think about? What is going through minds at this point? And I can tell, like, 'cause sometimes where he'll bring up those kinds of things, like, I know it's like definitely not the most politically correct, and I would never advocate if I had sons to have like done anything like this, but it is what it is. This is just what teenage boys go through, so I full empathy.
Exactly. But that being said, the subject matter and the bleak portrayal and the even the quirkiness of the lines, the delivery, all that, it stuck with me to the point where when I saw the book available for audio download, I grabbed that. And when I saw the TV show was in production, I got excited for that. So I've been a Handmaid's Tale fan ever since seeing this movie on HBO back in the mid-90s. And I now know that it is not the greatest movie in the universe, but it does hit these themes, and it does leave you wondering later on, after you're done watching the movie, could it come to that? Now, this same stuff is being done better in other places, but it was one of the only things kind of asking those questions at that time. We were still getting a lot of popcorn movies in that era that weren't trying to approach things like that.
It was very hard to watch the Handmaid's Tale film. Obviously, you know, we know what happens to the Handmaid's Tale. They are raped. And so I'd kind of been used to not seeing films lately where it's like more like suggestive in the scene, but they don't actually show the rape in like fullness. And I think that I hadn't really like seen that in a while. And I am a survivor of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And so I knew that it was coming. I knew that it was in the books. I'd seen it in the previous show, but it was still like so incredibly hard to watch. And then they made me watch it again. So they made me watch it twice in the movie. And that was really difficult. So it kind of made me, I left The Handmaid's Tale feeling more nauseous than I did like Children of Men. Children of Men felt a little bit more like inspiring. And they did have a lot of like cringy stress moments, but more of like of other stuff. But like this particularness of this Handmaid's Tale, like I like Robert Duvall, but I couldn't even look at him for the rest of the movie. It was hard.
Yeah. I mean, if you've seen him on things where you like him, whether he's a cowboy or he's in The Godfather or whatever, you're like, hey, that's an actor I like. And then you see him in this and you're like, I hate that guy.
That's how it was when I was like, ooh, I'm going to watch The Handmaid's Tale. I know that Robert Duvall's in it. I'm excited. I was a Godfather fan. And they had so many like moments where I was like, the camera's right on his fucking face. And I'm like, God fucking damn it. Like, I fucking hate this like so badly. But I also like tend to remember, and maybe this is just because I am a survivor, that I need other people to feel that kind of like discomfort so that they could have built more empathy for women when women come in, or anybody comes and approaches them about sexual assault and stuff like that. Because I remember in college, like I was talking to just somebody I just met and he made a comment that said, oh, all girls have a story like that. Like this very dismissive and belittling, and it was very hurtful for me. And I was in my early 20s, so I decided at that point it impacted me on making a decision on not talking about it further. And I think it just made things harder for me as I like kept going. And I remember that I'm not the only one. There's millions of girls and millions of children. I know that women are not the only ones, but I'm just speaking specifically because of the context of this story. As much as I fucking hated it and I wanted to also have my hand on that knife as I cut his artery in his neck, I thought maybe it'll really drive somebody to realize like somebody could feel this way. I thought Natasha Richardson's reaction during those rape scenes was so like heartbreaking. It was very difficult to watch her. And if it inspired some kind of empathy in people to teach our children better, then it's okay. But I could definitely see how that would not be very popular to receive in the early 90s.
It was not, for sure. It definitely sat for a while before it got picked up again. But maybe it's a lack of those introspective type questions being asked to audiences that, who knows, helped get us to the place where it becomes one of the most popular TV shows going. Things didn't continue to get better the way we thought they could have. And so now we need to ask these questions because there are decisions being made that a lot of us wish or look at them and be like, how did we put things in reverse from where we were?
I just slightly disagree that it didn't improve as much as we thought it did. I think really it's more like this stuff has always been bad. And society has been like sweeping it under the rug and keeping it hidden forever and just telling everybody things have gotten better for women or like, and just focusing on like the laws and stuff. But honestly, like there's this big culture of silence amongst families when they learn about abuse that's happening within families. And I think that society also supported this culture of silence, to be continuously silent about this stuff. And I think that we just thought that it got worse when the Me Too stuff came out. But it just finally is getting a little bit more respect and visibility finally, but it's always been there and not really being addressed.
That actually ties into one of the themes that I detected in both movies, addressed in completely different ways. But this idea of numbness or lack of sensation. In The Handmaid's Tale, one of the ways they accomplish that is by limiting the color palette. We don't see them do anything like, I don't know, give the handmaids. We do. We do see them give the handmaids drugs, which I can assume are, I don't know, maybe vitamins, but also probably downers or behavior type modification type medications. And through Natasha Richardson's portrayal of Kate or Offred, you often get this sense that she's not fully able to deal with what's happening right in front of her right then. And then you go to, say, Children of Men. Visually, there's a couple things, like, say, the moment when Theo is kidnapped by Julian and they have him in that box with the lights coming through the newspaper. That's pretty intense, right? But a lot of the rest of it has, like she describes as he's leaving, that ooh sound is your ear cells dying and never hearing that sound again.
You know that ringing in your ears? That ee? That's the sound of the ear cells dying, like their swan song.
If you notice, like, the soundtrack for the movie has a lot of that ooh sound happening throughout the rest of it. And I think that's indicative of us getting more and more numb as we go, right? Losing more and more sensation as we exist in this world, absorbing what's happening. You know, the soldiers attacking their own people, or the immigrants, or the terrorists storming Bexhill, only to find Key in the baby. They're willing to upset everything. It's not even really a great balance, but it's some kind of balance that the British government has in place. But they're willing to upset all of that to get a hold of the baby and rush in. What you just said about families impressing upon their family members a sense of numbness, it's one approach, I guess. Lack of sensitivity is another way to look at it with regard to these topics. It's almost like the filmmakers are addressing that and kind of extrapolating that forward through these different ways.
That line kind of stuck with me a little bit as she was saying that. And I'm going to have to go back and kind of experience it again with that in mind. I really like how you describe that, because right off the bat, it's just kind of really exciting kind of environment. A lot of stuff happening right away. And by the end of it, yeah, we are kind of like used to it. Now it's just about making it to the end. But
Right, exactly. Get to the boat. Did you detect any other themes tying them together or separating them that you wanted to discuss?
The themes that I had written were the low fertility, the dystopian kind of government. And so I think that we covered what I had in mind. But if anything comes up.
The verdict.
Well, do we have a clear winner here? For me, it's easy. It's Children of Men. I give Children of Men 4.5 baby Diegos. This version of The Handmaid's Tale has all the same beats and story as the novel and the first season of the TV show, but ultimately it feels kind of drab and lifeless. I have to give it 2 red veils out of 5.
I'm probably going to give Handmaid's Tale a 3.5 for like impact of the story. It did stick with me. I thought it was some really strong performances. I had left with the shock, and usually if I'm left with a little bit of a shock, that usually means I had a good experience like with it. I'm aligned with it. I'm knocking off a couple of veils there for the same reasons that you're talking about, that the delivery isn't nearly as sexy as we have seen in other things. And I think that could definitely have been why it didn't get nearly as much credit as it probably could have, probably should have gotten. I really liked the movie. I really did. It'd be my first time seeing it. And I also tend to kind of have a bias against older movies, like right off the bat. Like, I think that's just like a millennial, like a quick, like a kind of thing that I do. But I was trying really hard to suppress that bias and focus on just what it is. And I thought it was really good and impactful on that point. I want to give Children of Men 5. Was it 5 baby Diegos?
5 baby Diegos.
Is that the max?
Is that the max? That is as many baby Diegos as you can give it.
Yay! I wanted to have all of the baby Diegos because the cinematography, man, the scenes of how they delivered those was so fucking fun. Like it was, I know the story is awful. I get it. But the way that they orchestrated, in these single shots that for extended periods of time, that was just so masterful to me because it had so many details that gave me so much context to the story of what we were experiencing without having to tell me that this is what they're doing. I didn't have to listen to a conversation between people to get it, to feel it, and to empathize with it. And oh my God, the cast was fantastic. The cast was so, so wonderful. Jasper,
Alfonso
Oh.
hates exposition. He wants to put everything up on screen that you need to understand the story. And he
Oh, I
would
love that.
probably love to hear you say that you don't want to hear somebody explaining the whole story, in order to
Yeah.
understand what's happening.
I love it. One of my favorite hobbies that I do is puzzles. I do just brain puzzles all the time. It's my thing. I'm obsessed. And I love movies that let me do that, let me kind of like piece things together. It was so raw. The rawness mixed with this like genius cinematography, it was so impactful. And I am mad at myself that I haven't been loving this film since 2006 to present. So I'm going to give it all 5 Baby Diegos.
All 5. I had to take off a half Baby Diego just for that one scene in Bexhill where the fishes just happened to stumble across Theo and Key. Like, what? This whole thing? You got what? Come on now.
You're right. That does like adding a little bit of cheesiness to a film that's been so raw and intense. You're right. It could definitely do that. But I honestly felt like everything else was so masterful that didn't even matter to me anymore. And it didn't last very long.
Just watching that whole last, 40 minutes or something where every extra that you encounter is jabbering in their own language, trying to ask for help, plead for help, anything that they can get. It is utterly convincing that they are pleading with you. It's almost like Clive Owen stumbled into something that was actually happened and they just filmed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it
was
did
so
feel like
convincing.
that. Mm-hmm. No, that's exactly. Those are the details that fucking matter. And they took the time to design these environments and choreograph how we were going to receive this message. By far superior delivery than Handmaid's Tale.
It's interesting. I mean, the TV show obviously has taken the air out of the room for needing to explore another cinematic version of The Handmaid's Tale. There's no need to do that now.
Yeah, I agree.
Everything that needs to be done there is being done on the TV show. But I think you'd have to be very cynical or something to watch this Handmaid's Tale, even with its flaws, and not come away without having taken something from it, a question, a concern, a new perspective on these things, these themes that for some reason, when authors look forward from now, they keep seeing these same things in their crystal balls. Things get worse, not better. Governments get tighter, not easier.
Mm-hmm.
Things for women don't improve. They get worse. And that was a movie that approached that when it wasn't cool to approach that. For
sure. Definitely got to give them the points for that. It's been like my whole life has been being told like what is expected of me as my role as a woman, as a wife. And I think that I just kind of built like a natural need to rebel against that. So I tend to try to do like what I want just for the sake of seeing what I can get away with, because government and everybody's telling me that I'm allowed to do this. But when I start to action it, I start to get criticized by it, by my family members, by friends, by like, society in general. If I'm a working mom, I'm not being a good 100% mom. If I'm a stay-at-home mom, then I'm like lazy, not doing anything all day. So they're like, what is it, people? so I think like the battle about like, and I don't hear these kinds of conversations and things that are centered around men's lives. So I think that this topic is never going to go out of style, especially now that women are being more emboldened and more empowered to be able to highlight these kinds of injustices that are happening to them. These stories are just going to come back to life, if anything.
These are interesting times. We are living through a Chinese curse by living in interesting times, are we not?
Yeah, but this is a really fun pair up, and I just thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation.
Well, thanks for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Battle Beyond the Movies, and we'll come back for our next one as I tackle a dish best served cold with Inez's with Inez's sister Gabby. We'll be comparing masterworks featuring Matthew McConaughey and Lindsay Lohan when Gabby and I discuss Sweet Revenge as we take a look at A Time to Kill versus Mean Girls.
I am so ready to listen to that one. I cannot wait to hear how that conversation goes.
If you like this, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at Paul V. Daily or at Pod Clubhouse or www.podclubhouse.com. Inez, if, say, a listener wanted to reach out to you, how would they find you?
You know, I am one half of a podcast group with Gabby. So right now, you can find us on Twitter at Aspie_anything on Twitter. And we're currently a duo exploring different views and obstacles in life with our neurodivergent backgrounds. And we love talking about movies. So you can find us on there.
Well, thank you again, Inez, for coming on this episode. This is a very young podcast. It's a new idea, still working out the kinks. I hope you'll be back. I hope I didn't chase you off. Once we got to talking, I realized for a second, holy crap, this is a much more serious conversation than I was ready for. Batten down the hatches, because we are in the middle of a very serious conversation. And I'm glad you were the right person to have this conversation with. I hope I came up to your level, Inez.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. I always enjoy hanging out with Pod Clubhouse. So thank you. I'm excited to come back.
Thank you for listening. This has been an original Pod Clubhouse production. Pod Clubhouse is a podcast network dedicated to encouraging collaboration among podcasters and friends to bring a fresh voice and diverse perspective on a wide array of content. Please visit and leave a comment for us at podclubhouse.com. Rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast feeds on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Pod Clubhouse. Our DMs are always open, and we'd love to hear from you.
Pod Clubhouse.